Welcome to your next game design tutorial. So what are we going to be doing in this one? We're going to start taking a look at adding graphics. We're going to add graphics for the background, so a star field that's going to then animate down so it looks like the spaceship is flying. Then we're also going to go ahead and take a look at adding particle effects to the ship itself. That way it looks like the rocket engine is firing as well. Then adding both of these effects together, it's going to make it look like the spaceship is flying through space. I'm Jerry from Bliz Studio, creator of the Apple-featured game Trixel Rocket. And if you're enjoying this tutorial series, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and the little bell icon so you know when the next video is available. And if you're ready to get started, let's go. So we're going to start off this tutorial going into Photoshop. Now you can use whatever tool that you have. So if you don't have Photoshop like I do, you can use GIMP, which is free. You can use MS Paint. You can use whatever tool that you have. There's lots of tools out there. Take a look. Anyway, I'm using Photoshop because I have a CC subscription. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and create a graphic that's 1920 by 1080. So that's kind of the size of my screen that I'm creating at 72 pixels an inch. I'm going to go ahead and click Create. It creates this white background graphic, and I'm going to actually make that transparent. So I'm going to go ahead and just add a new layer. And I'm going to take that background, I'm going to invert it to black. You can grab some black over here with a paintbrush or something and fill it. For me, it's easy because I can just hit Command I or Control I and it does the same thing. It just makes it all black. Now, I'm doing this, even though I'm going to make it transparent, just so I can see what I'm drawing. And how I'm going to start this out is I'm just going to grab my pencil and I'm going to just start making up some stars, right? So we just kind of plant those around wherever. Now you can find some star field brushes out there, so you can find those on DeviantArt or whatever type of place that you can find Photoshop brushes. There's tons of those kind of places out there. And I'm just kind of varying the size of these. So some small stars, some bigger, and just kind of spreading them around so that there's kind of no real pattern to this. We kind of want it to be fairly random. And then I'm going to add a few stars that are just a little bit bigger here and there. Okay. Now you're noticing I'm not sticking anything on the very edge. The reason being is that we're going to have this replicate itself. So, and what we're going to do is we're going to create this sheet. We're going to apply this as a texture to that sheet, and then we're going to animate it. So whenever part of it comes off, it's going to then rotate on top. And so we never want there to be like an edge to this. So that's why I didn't draw any of these on the edge. Now there's some that are fairly close, but this kind of gets us where we need to be. Now you can see that there's some of these stars that are, I kind of have a blue brush. You can use white, which works perfectly well. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and I've locked the transparency. So that means that I can now only paint where there are actual pixels. And I'm going to just change the color of this just a little bit to maybe a little bit more on the red side or pink side. If you ever look at the stars at night, you kind of notice that stars aren't always white. Some of them are a little bit different color. Some are blue, some are a little pinkish or reddish. There are all kinds of different colors out there. So I added a little bit of variety there. So cool. All right, the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a little bit of an effect to this, and I'm going to unlock the layer transparency and go ahead and add an effect. And this is just to add a glow. So I'm going to add an outer glow to each of these spots. So let me just zoom in so you can kind of see what that looks like. And that is a little harsh, so I'm going to go ahead and change the size of this just a little bit and the spread. Doesn't have to be anything dramatic. If you want to, you can create a couple extra layers, and some have glows, some don't, to add some variety. For now, I'm just kind of leaving it as it is. Cool. All right, so we now have a star field background. So I'm going to make that background black, transparent. And the reason I'm making it transparent is because I'm going to layer a couple of these on top of each other and change the speed, so that way we create what's called parallax. So if you look at anything in the distance, if you're driving down the highway, you're looking off at a mountain in the distance, it moves really, really slow, and then something that's very close to you moves really, really fast, right? Like the highway signs next to you are going really fast, but the mountains in the distance are going really slow. That's a parallax effect. And so we're going to create something very, very similar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save this as a PNG file. And I have in my game folder, there's a sprites folder. That's where I'm storing that rocket. And I'm also going to save the stars there. So background dash stars. Cool. I'm also going to go ahead and save this Photoshop file so I can go back to it if I need to. But I'm not going to save it in my game. I'm going to save it outside of my game. So I just went to the folder where everything resides. And I'm going to make a new folder for PSD. This is kind of my naming convention. That stands for Photoshop file. You can call it graphics, you can call it illustrations, you can call it whatever. This is just what I name it. So I'm going to click create, and then I'm going to save this as background stars.psd. Click OK. And now we can get out of Photoshop and get over into Unity. So here we are in Unity. We have that background graphic inside of our game. So now I'm going to create a material. Okay, so if you imagine a material, if you imagine a sheet and then you've printed something on top of it, we're going to create that, whatever that print is, the look of the print. And then we're actually going to apply it to a sheet as our background. Okay, so we're going to create, again, try to stay organized. I usually have a folder for materials. So I'm going to create a new folder. Call that materials. And then inside of that, I'm going to create a new material. So I'm going to right click, create material, and we'll call this background stars. Cool. So now with that selected, that material selected, you can see it looks a little bit different than the icon for the graphic. It's a little circle with kind of a white spot on it. And then here is a preview of that material. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our background sprite. So here we are in the inspector. I'm going to take that background graphic that we created, and I'm going to drag it into the albedo of the material. So that's saying, hey, instead of making it just a color, apply this graphic and use that graphic instead of a color. We're also going to change the render mode from opaque to transparent. And then once we've done that, we're kind of set up. I'm going to leave the metallic to 0. Smoothness 0.5 is perfectly fine. We're going to go ahead and just leave that, and I think we're good. We don't want specular highlights, don't want reflections. Okay, so that's good. Now we can go ahead and to create that sheet that material is then going to be applied to. So I'm going to, in my hierarchy, I'm going to go right click and 3D object and do a quad. So a quad is kind of creating that sheet. So I want to do this in the scene here so you can see how big this is. Now we know that graphic that we created is 1920 by 1080. So we're going to scale this to be about that size. So I'm going to do 19 meters by, and if we want to get a little, we can do 19.20 by 10.80. There we go. We're pretty exact. And then we can kind of put it where our camera is going to see it. Okay. So now we haven't applied that material just yet. We need to actually apply that material. So here we're going to take that material. So with our quad selected, we're going to take and drag that down into the materials that are right there in the mesh render. So you can see it has a default material. We're going to drag our material that we created into it. Cool. So now you can see these little red outlines. So that's kind of where the graphic is, but they're not the color that we created. So because this is a 3D object, it needs to have some light to light it up. So we actually need to create a light in the scene. So I need to go over here in the hierarchy, and I'm going to create a light and a directional light. A directional light is a light that affects everything in the scene. Just like the sun kind of lights up everything, you know, across the globe where it's at. A directional light is very, very similar. Okay. I'm also going to play around with the rotation of it. So I hit the rotation tool up here, and you can see that there's a green kind of curve, a red curve, and a blue curve. This is the angle, what that light is, and you can see how it kind of lights up or doesn't light up the stars there. So I'm just going to kind of get it so where it lights up the stars. And even though you see it here in the scene, if you click on game, you don't see the light. It just actually lights up the graphic. So there we go. We've got our quad in there with our material. So here's the fun part. So we're now going to create a Playmaker FSM that's going to make that material move. And there's one more thing that I need to do with my graphic. I'm going to select the graphic itself, the sprite, and I'm going to change the wrap mode in the inspector, wrap mode right here, clamp. We're going to change that to repeat. So that way, if we move that texture, it's going to take whatever it cuts off and apply it back. So again, it's just going to kind of do this kind of repeat kind of thing. So click apply, and that's good to go. All right, so now we can go to our quad. So our quad is what we're going to attach our FSM, because that has the material on it that we want to animate. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to first go into my Playmaker editor and right click and add FSM. And then you can title this whatever you want. I'm not going to create another state, so we can just leave it as state 1 if you want. But I like to name my states so I know exactly what that state does. So I'm going to change it to background move. Okay. All right. So the next trick is that we are going to take and create a float. Now here's where we kind of get into a little bit of kind of float int and what those things are. So we're going to do a float. Now if I can spell that right, we're going to do a float add. So I'm going to drag that down in. Now float's a number, and it's a number that can have a decimal point. And you'll see an int as another option. An int does not have a decimal point. So an int is only whole numbers. A float can have a decimal point, so it can be more or less than a whole number. Okay. So we are going to take and we're going to create a variable. So we're going to take this and we're going to create a new variable, and we're going to call this movement. And so what we're doing, we're just going to store the movement of this, and we're going to make that as the speed of what our object's going to move. So our animation is going to move. And I want to update this every frame. And then I also am going to add a speed to this. So every frame we want to move this so far. I'm going to start this out at 0.4, and then we can always adjust as we go. So what we're doing is we're creating a little package of information saying this is going to be our movement speed, and we're going to move at 0.4 every frame. And then I also am going to say what is it that we're moving? Well, we're going to move the texture that's on that quad material. So we have our quad selected, right? We've got this mesh render, and inside of that is this texture that we created, the material that we created. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the texture offset. So type in texture, set texture offset. So every frame we're going to offset that just by a little bit. So we're going to kind of like bump it down. So I drag that over as well. So we're set a variable of the speed, and now we're going to set up the animation of that with texture offset. So we do want to use the owner. So the object is the quad, The material index, we're just going to leave that as 0, the texture name as main text, and then we're going to offset that on the y-axis with our variable that we set up here called movement. So I'm going to change this to a variable and change that to movement. So there we go. We've set that up, and we also want to set that up to be every frame. So hopefully we're doing this on the y-axis, which makes it move up or down, and the x-axis goes horizontally. So we want to definitely make sure we go up and down on this. So let's give this a test and see how it works. Oh my gosh, that's moving super fast. So we need to play with something here. So we're going to change that to every frame every second per second. So let's change and see how that looks. And that's not too bad. That's probably moving just a little bit on the fast side. Again, it's one of those things we can play with. I'm going to change that from 0.4 to maybe 0.1. So it moves fairly slow. Hit play and test it. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now that we've done that, we're going to duplicate this and then have a second version. Okay, so we'll take that quad and I'm going to hit Command D or Control D, and now we have a second quad. And because it has that FSM attached to it, it now has that same information, but because it's duplicated, it has its own version of that. So now we can just play with changing the numbers here. And let's see, instead of doing 0.1, let's do 0.2 and see what that does. Now you can see that it kind of starts out together, but one's moving a little bit faster than the other, and I think that looks pretty good. So it's kind of creating that effect where something is moving in front of another. Now we can change this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the scale of the quad to be from a positive 19 to a negative 19, which effectively just flips it. So I'm going to do that real quick on the x-axis. So from a positive 19 to a negative 19. And that should give us a little bit more of a variety with that background. Boom, and that looks pretty darn good. Cool, so let's call the background done. Now, the next thing we need to do is something that's a little more fun for me, and it's adding a particle effect to the ship. So, of course, you know, a rocket's flying in space. It's not going to have something that's not pushing it, right? We need to be flying, so we're going to add a particle effect. So I'm going to take my rocket, and I'm going to right-click or control-click, and we're going to add a effect. So we're going to add a particle system. Now the cool thing about a particle system is that it generates these particles, and right now they're kind of like going all over the place, but we can direct where those things go. So here, this isn't going to be a full particle system tutorial because there is so much here. There's so much information. Each one of these things has each one of these little drawers has a ton of information in it, which you can change the way something looks. But what we're going to do is I'm just going to kind of go through this from a very simple basis. I'm going to zoom in here. And the particle system is a 3D object. So we just need to keep that in mind, even though we're kind of in 2D. It is actually 3D, so it's sending these particles out all over the place. And currently we have the particle effect looping. That's perfectly fine because we want this to kind of always be firing. We can go ahead and pre-warm it. Pre-warming means that there's already going to be particles out when the game starts, as opposed to then they start and move out. We want them to already be there. So that's what pre-warm is. Start lifetime, this is the lifetime of the particles themselves. So currently right now, they all last for 5 seconds. So they're kind of flying out and they last for 5 seconds. Usually I do this on almost all of these things. I'm going to do a random between two constants. So instead of lasting 5 seconds, we want them to last, let's say maybe 0.1 to 0.3 seconds. So they're going to end a lot faster. The other thing that we're going to do is change the start size. And again, I don't want all these particles to be exactly the same size. I'm going to have them be different sizes. So again, I'm going to do random between two constants. And currently 0.1 is, or at 1, it's 1 meter. And we're going to take that and we're going to make those a lot smaller. So let's say 0.02 to maybe 0.5. And that's probably even a little bit too big. Let's go to 0.1. So they're a lot more small. So right now we're going to change emission. It's creating 10 of these every second. And we want that to be a lot more. So let's change this from 10 to maybe 100. And we can kind of see how that goes, maybe even 200. And they're kind of all going out in different directions, which is the shape of the particle system. So I'm going to change emission and open up the drawer for shape. So you can see the shape is currently a cone and it's faced directly at us. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncage my 2D. And we'll go to our particle system, and you can see kind of the shape of that particle system. Currently, it's kind of moving out that direction. We want it to face down. So I'm going to use my rotation and then rotate that down. So I could do that easier up here in my particle system. Rotation of the transform, we're going to change that to 90. So that's directly down. Okay, let's go back to our 2D effect here. And you can see now the better the shape of the cone. So it's kind of starting small and then kind of going out wide. So what we're going to do is to take the shape of this cone and change it a little bit. So go back down into our shape preferences here. So I'm going to take the angle, take that way down, and then we're going to take the scale of that way down. So we have the scale right here. So we're going to scale that. Oops, not up. We're going to scale it down. And let's say 0.1. That's probably looking a little bit better. I think these particles are moving probably too fast, so we can go out to our start speed. So let's call shape done. I'm going to go to start speed, and we're going to change that from constant to a random between two constants here, and then let's say 0.2 to 0.6. And that might be a little too slow. Let's go 0.8 to 1.5 maybe. That's not too bad. And I'm going to kind of move that to where it needs to be, kind of at the bottom of the rocket. And we're getting a little closer, I think. Emission, we can probably bump that up a little bit. So let's say maybe 400. And I can probably bump up the size of those just a little bit. So let's say on the start size, instead of 0.2, let's maybe go 0.6 to maybe 0.6. Whoa, too big. 0.3, 0.1, 0.2. Yeah, that's not too bad. I think that looks pretty good right there. Now, the other thing that I want to do is to change the color. So we can do a start color here. And let's change that to maybe be a little bit of an orange. And again, we can do a random between, like random between two constants. We can also do that a random between two colors. So I'm going to go change one color to orange. And then you can see currently the other color is white. So every time a particle is generated, it's doing one or the other. And in this case, we want to go, let's maybe a little bit on the red side. Change it a little more orange maybe. And then we can have maybe one of these be a little more blue. No, definitely not. Do yellow. Yeah, I think that works. So now you can kind of see the particles are a little bit more random. Cool. So I think that's looking pretty good. The other thing that I don't like is that the particles are ending and then just disappearing. So they're going to be 100% opaque all the way. Well, I want them to kind of like fade out as they go. So we're going to open up another one of these little trays. So we're going to do color over lifetime. So we'll click that on and then open that up, and we're going to do color. And the only thing that I'm going to change here is I've got the color down below and then the opacity up above. So this is the lifetime of the particle. So from when it begins to when it ends. And I'm going to take the opacity of when it ends to be 0. So it kind of fades out over time. So there we're kind of looking like it's more of a rocket. So with that done, hopefully this gives us something that looks more like a rocket flying in space. So I'm going to go back into my game. So I think I'm going to change the lifetime of the particles here from, let's go maybe 0.4 to 0.7 maybe. Yeah, there we go. That's a little bit better. And then I'm also going to, in the color over lifetime, I'm going to make them last a little bit, the color last a little bit longer. So I'm going to take this first opacity and bring that back down so that they fade to transparent, just the last part of the life of that particle. And I think that looks pretty good. So now all we need to do is play it to see how this thing looks. So now we have a rocket that's actually flying in space. It looks pretty cool. Okay, so the other thing that I've noticed is that my ship is actually a little bit dull. And what's happening is the quad is actually in front of my character. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this off, go to my game, and then click on both these quads. And then I'm going to change the Z axis. So if I uncage my 2D game, you can see here's the kind of like the 2D space. I'm going to take those quads and move them back just a little bit, so that way they're not in front of my character. And then go back to 2D, and then let's give it a play again real quick. Boom, there we go. Now this is looking pretty good. In this tutorial, you learned a little bit about making graphics, adding those back into Unity, making it look like the spaceship is flying through space. And then we also created particle effects and added that to the ship so that it made it look like the ship is moving. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and that little bell icon down there so you know when the next video is available. Until next time, keep creating.